that Adam opened his eyes. First time. Has never seen the sunlight, has never seen a tree, has never seen grass, never seen anything. The poor guy, he opens his eyes for the first time. He does not have a clue what lies ahead for him. He didn't understand that. He didn't even understand that he had a woman in his future. He didn't understand it beyond that God had a plan, and that he was a part of that plan, that he was the pivotal starting point of that plan where man was concerned. He didn't understand that God had a long-term plan. And it would be interesting to know how much God hardwired into Adam's brain, from the beginning, and how much software he loaded in there with it. We know he had a language. We know he had various cognitive skills. His brain was designed from the word go so that it would be able to interpret visual signals coming in. You may think that that's obvious, but it really isn't obvious. That's something that had to be provided for. People who have been deprived of sight for a long time have to learn how to see again. It is a cognitive process. Apparently Adam opens his eyes, he can see. There's no need for a training period for his brain to be able to interpret the signals that are coming in from his eyes. So the whole thing was pre-programmed, set up properly in the beginning, and a lot of things were put in there that we can only guess about. He had a logical system so that he could synthesize knowledge out of information. We really don't think often of how much of what we know comes about because we have synthesized two disrelated facts that logically we've been able to put together and come up with a third piece of information which is not necessarily obvious if you only had one or the other of those facts. So we do this all the time, and it creates sometimes mistaken impressions because we think we know things that we don't know. But oftentimes, most of the time, it creates a logical, cognitive picture of life ahead of us that we are able to live our way through. There's reason to believe that God also placed in the heart of Adam and all men to follow him some files, using computer terminology, of which man was unaware, but which would ultimately bring man to the point where he would have to deal with God. That man who would not know these things. C.S. Lewis reasoned that the mind of man contains a certain sense of right and wrong, of which man is consciously unaware, but which still directs his actions, and his actions toward other people, his demands of other people, and his expectations of other people as to what's right and what's wrong. And Lewis's argument is really hard to refute. It seems very plain as you make your way through culture to culture to culture in the world that man has an innate sense of right and wrong on the most basic things of human nature and human relationships. Solomon had also come to realize that there was an innate sense, even a drive in man, that man really cannot explain. In Ecclesiastes 3, he said, I have seen the travail. This is in verse 10. I've seen the work which God has given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has set eternity in their heart so that no man can find out the work that God makes from the beginning to the end. Now, I think that this is an absolutely fascinating statement that Solomon came to. And you can see with the fact that of how long ago he came to this realization. That God has somehow programmed us, hardwired us, or loaded the software, whatever terminology you'd like to put in there, so that man has a subconscious awareness of eternity. That eternity is out there. It goes. It's an interesting thing, by the way. The word that is translated eternity, it's a correct translation. It's the best way to translate it. But the idea of the Hebrew word is the vanishing point. As you look out into the distance, you see parallel lines that are running out of this. There comes a point where they come together and they no longer look like two lines. And then there's the point where you can no longer see them at all. It is the vanishing point. The point, not where things cease to exist, but where we can no longer see them. He has set eternity in man's heart so that no man can find out the work that God makes from the beginning to the end. Now, that hasn't kept us from trying, has it? We love to speculate about what God is doing and where he is going. We love to pick the little clues that he's given us in the Bible and extrapolate from them and say, well, if that's true, then this must be true. And if those two things are true, then that must be true. And we develop some interesting ideas about what the future is. And yet Solomon said a long time ago, he set us up in such a way that we cannot find out the end from the beginning. And poor Adam, he woke up the very beginning of all things human. And there was no way that from the beginning that he could possibly understand or grapple with the end of these things. So here's Adam, the first day of his life, with eternity embedded in his heart, and no idea whatever of what the end would be. He didn't even know what tomorrow might hold. What was Adam supposed to do? How was he supposed to live his life? What did he know? You know, today we create great edifices of things we perceive as knowledge, doctrines, dogmas, teachings, requirements, prophetic structures, and so forth. And where some people are prone to think that, well, you've got to understand at least a modicum of this, or you've got to understand a great deal of it, or you've got to have accomplished this set of things. Only then can you be baptized. Only then can you be a part of the family of God. Well, what did Adam know of the things that we think are important? What did he know of all this great structure of doctrine and theology that man has put together? The answer is practically nothing. So how on earth could he live? How could he possibly know what to do from one moment to the next? Actually, Adam probably knew a great deal more than we think. One thing he knew essential gardening, because he was commanded from the first day, to dress and keep this garden that I have put around you. And I would have to assume that along with the language, he understood what dress and keep meant, and that therefore there were certain responsibilities. There's an awareness. I talked about this before, how that the Garden of Eden, as perfect as it was, if it were not maintained, would have gone to rack and ruin because it was subject to the law of entropy. And so when Adam was put in there to struggle against the law of entropy as it might take effect in the Garden of Eden, dress it and keep it. So he had basic gardening skills. And he knew what he should eat and what he should not eat. How many trees were there in the garden, you suppose? 50? 100? Maybe more? How many of them were forbidden? 1. That's all. Now, I would call that a real simple challenge. Take care of the garden and eat of any tree you want except this one. That should have been a really easy command to obey, I would have thought. And apart from that, life was visiting with God and learning more about God and learning more about what God was doing and, of course, getting to know Eve, which was a lot of fun all by itself. Now, it's tempting to think that we know a lot more than Adam knew. But really, how much is knowledge worth if you can't use it? You know, is it really worth something to know it? I mean, did it mean anything to you if it's absolutely useless knowledge, nothing you can do with it along the way? It would be assuming, I think, it might even be as tempting to think that we know more about eternity than Adam did. But that would be assuming that we know something about eternity, and that's a very large question mark. The truth is, just like Adam, we are unable to know the end from the beginning. Because there are too many variables, there are too many things that can happen, too many changes that can take place, and so consequently, we can only have the vaguest ideas of what God might be doing. We cannot know the end from the beginning. And if you think of a ratio of knowledge you can use compared to knowledge that you have, Adam knew just about as much as we do. He may have had a higher ratio because his requirements were simpler. Adam didn't have to think, for example, about the moral issues connected with abortion or with cloning, because those things that were technically impossible, technically unheard of, were things he didn't have to deal with. So as far as his quantity of knowledge, of useful knowledge to him, I think he may have even known more than you and I know when it comes right down to it. But haven't some things been revealed to later generations that weren't known to former generations? Oh, yeah, absolutely. But hasn't a lot of stuff been lost from previous generations that we would, give a lot to know what it was? I mean, which of us in reading through Paul's letters haven't said, why did he say that? What's the background of that? I mean, how was the church structured at that time? Did it follow the synagogue? What was the synagogue like? As we try to work our way through the problems that we have in a modern world and not only in our own lives with ethical problems, we look back to that world and we would really give a lot to know what Jesus meant by this statement, what he meant by that statement, how he expects us to actually use this piece of information. So a lot of information that was available to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we don't have and would dearly like to have. There were a lot of things that we, I think, know today that they would dearly like to have known and that they didn't. So the next question is, how can we say that we really have that much more useful knowledge? That is, knowledge that we can actually apply to the way we live our life today than Adam had, or Abraham, or David, or Matthew, or Paul. Well, without knowing the end from the beginning, how was Adam supposed to conduct his life? You know, since he couldn't grasp certain things. As far as we know, he knew nothing of the kingdom of heaven beyond the possible fact that he thought he was living in it. Because that Garden of Eden, as it was when he was there, I mean, the difference between that and heaven, you'd have to reach a bit. He knew nothing of the work and ministry of Jesus to come. He knew nothing of the vast complex of Christian and later, first Jewish and then later Christian theology. He knew nothing about the doctrines of justification and salvation. He hadn't sinned. He didn't need to know anything about justification and salvation. He never heard of the Trinity. He never heard of the Holy Ghost. He never heard of speaking in tongues. He never heard of faith healing. Never heard of a lot of things that form the core of the faith of a lot of Christian denominations. Adam never heard of them. So, how was he supposed to have, how was it possible for Adam to have a life without all these wonderful things? What was he supposed to do? You know, it's really simple. He was to take pleasure in his work. He was to take pleasure in his wife and in building a relationship with her. He was to enjoy his food and drink. He was to rest one day out of 7. He was to take pleasure in his growing relationship with God, and he was not to eat of that tree, that one tree, that one right there. That was basically it. It was a piece of cake, or it really should have been. But life, well, not life is a lot more complicated for you and me, isn't it, than it was for Adam. It's just a lot more difficult. I don't know. The challenge that faces us is pretty simple, too. We are to take pleasure in our work. We're to take pleasure in our family and building a relationship with Him. We're to enjoy our food and drink. We're to rest one day out of 7. And we're to take pleasure in a growing relationship with God every day. And we're not supposed to eat of that tree either, when it comes right down to it. So, you know, when you think about it, what we have a habit of doing is making our life and the requirements that we have to live by a lot more complicated than they need to be. And one of the reasons we do this is because we forget that we don't know the end. We cannot know the end from the beginning. And that therefore our challenge is to live in the here and the now. How hard is this? You know, well, it's very hard, isn't it, to keep that in mind. It's very hard to keep those facts straight. The problem for us, of course, is that tree has become a much more complicated equation. Or at least we think it has. Do you realize why it is so much more complex for us than it was for Adam when God says, eat it all, don't eat that tree? One of the reasons, well, the primary reason is, the whole answer is in one word. It's sin. Sin has entered the picture, and therefore the complexities of sin, the complexities of obedience to God, the complexities of all this become really rather more involved than they would have been before. I think you might be fascinated if you study the law of Moses very carefully and ask yourself as you go, is this one of those laws that was added because of transgressions? If Adam had not sinned, would Adam need this law? You know, would man need this law if nobody had ever committed sin? And you will be surprised at how much of the laws you read have to do with the disciplining of a human being who is prone and inclined to sin, where sin has entered the world, sin has taken on a life of its own, sin tends to dominate the life, and therefore the discipline for Israel as a nation of slaves of getting to break the habit of sin is very strong in the law of Moses. Transgressions of a much simpler law was the reason why the law became so complex. So here we are, not knowing the end from the beginning. How shall we then live? What are we supposed to do? Well, one thing I think we need to understand is that man shall not live by theology alone. And I really feel that oftentimes, you know, you'll know this very much so if you're an internet browser and you go around to all the theology forums and all the Christian forums and denominational forums and listen to the discussions. You would think that the huge issues of life, those things that are life and death and that will have a difference in how you're going to spend your eternal life, were things like the Trinity. Whereas the fact is, you could be totally wrong about the actual, precise nature of God and still obey Him, still keep His laws, still live a good life, still avoid breaking the Ten Commandments, still trust in Jesus Christ and His sacrifice in your place, still be forgiven of your sins. That knowledge, whether you believe in the Trinity or not, probably has very little to do with how you live your life the rest of this day. And yet that is what people occupy themselves with. And as you go about from discussion to discussion, and you find out all the things that divide churches and separate brother between brother, these are not things that have much to do with how you actually live your life. They are things about how you think about God. They have to do with what goes on between your ears, not with what you do with your hands and your feet and how you love your brother. And I feel that we're missing some very valuable points. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 10, the preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright. It was words of truth. The words of the wise are as goads. They're like nails fastened by the masters of assembly, which are given from one shepherd. And further by these, my son, be admonished. Of the making of many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. It's really funny. Solomon, very wise man, didn't really have a lot of, encouragement to offer for studying books. He said they'll make books until there's no end of books. And that is certainly true. You should sometime look at the list of books in the Library of Congress and the whole list of books that are coming out new every day from publishers across the country and around the world. Books, and more books are being published all the time. You can only read a teeny fraction of all the books that are being written. You can't even read all the books that you're on topics that you're interested in, much less the ones that are boring to you. And so he says, of the making of books there is no end, and much study is a weariness to the flesh. Let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Let's get down to the basics. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. I understand that. So when you ask the question, how shall we live? Here's your answer. It isn't in theology. It isn't in all the chasing around of it. It isn't trying to speculate about the end times and beyond the end times in the universe. It's in how you live your life today. Fear God, keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man. That's pretty clear. Then comes one more verse here. For God shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing, whether it would be good or whether it be evil. Now, we really ought to, that should be to us like a jerk on the leash to a dog. The choke change and you come tight and jerk our little head around and we say, wait a minute. Every work is going to be brought into judgment. Now, let me ask you this. If you're spending all your time out there in the future somewhere speculating about what might be, while you're neglecting the way you live your life today, you're likely to get to the place to where you don't even feel the jerk on the chain when God comes along. But I will tell you, the jerk on the chain will come. And the jerk on the chain is this. My friend, you had better pay attention to how you live the rest of this day and tomorrow, because you're going to be judged for that. You're not going to escape it. You're not going to get out from under it somewhere. I know that there are all kinds of scriptures in the Bible that people like to go to, like their little proof text they pick out, that seem to say, well, yeah, the righteous are being judged now, and we come at the resurrection, we're all clear, and we're all free and clear, and we're ready to go. Okay, fine. But the righteous are being judged now. Don't you think they ought to worry about that? The fact of the matter is, he says, God shall bring every work to judgment. What are you going to do with that? I think we ought to think about that. I think we ought to pray about it. We go to bed at night and consider what the works were today that are going to be brought into judgment. Are they good? Are we going to be pleased that they're being judged? Are we going to be glad to deal with them? Are we going to be ashamed of them and embarrassed by them? There's a great temptation to pursue the knowledge of the end. I know I have that temptation. I even yield to it from time to time. But Solomon, who was a very wise man, warned us a long time ago. Son, you can't get there from here. Isn't that what he said? Isn't it? And he said, God has set eternity in men's hearts so that no man can know the end from the beginning. It's not possible. There's a great temptation to pursue a unified theory of God. As you probably have heard about the search for a unified theory of matter and energy and so forth. The physicists have been working on this for generations and will keep on working on it for generations. There's the same kind of a temptation to try to put together a unified theology of God, to finally put together the one set of doctrines, arguments, and explanations that will finally close out all the questions about God, convince all the sinners, convict all the people who disagree with you doctrinally, and finally, at last, we can all see the whole truth about God. Forget it. You can't get there from here. It will forever elude us. And there's a reason why God has done this. It is because He expects us to live well in the moment. Today. As the old song goes, and it's a good one, one day at a time, sweet Jesus, one day at a time. To walk with God today. There's this little passage in Hebrews. He cites in it a section from the Psalms. It's in Hebrews, the 3rd chapter. And I think it's an important one. Paul keeps, if it's Paul that wrote this, he keeps driving home this one little word in here that we need to hear. Wherefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you will hear His voice, don't harden your hearts as in the provocation in the day of temptation in the wilderness. Now, when are you supposed to hear this admonition to not harden your heart? Today, right? When your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works for 40 years. I was grieved with that generation, and I said, they're always going to err in their heart. They just don't know my ways at all. So I swore in my wrath, they will not enter into my rest. Take heed, brothers. Watch out for yourself, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. You've had a grip on the faith. You've believed God. You've trusted God. You have made sacrifices for God. You have done without for God. You've lost jobs for God. You've lost family members for God. Now, be careful, lest there be an evil heart of unbelief that causes you to let go. He said, exhort one another daily while it is called today. Exhort one another. You know, this is one of those scriptures, and there are many of them in the Bible, that underline again and again the need for church. Paul says not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together. Why? Well, if you're off by yourself somewhere, there's no one to come along and exhort you to do what you ought to do. No one to set an example for you. No one to make you uncomfortable if you're doing the wrong thing. And that sometimes is what our duty is to make our brothers and our sisters uncomfortable about the things that they are doing or about the things that they are not doing. Exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we are made partakers of Christ if, and that little if is it's very disturbing to think in these terms. You'd like to think that we have it all wrapped up, wouldn't you? You'd like to think, boy, the kingdom is coming, and I've got my place in it. I've been baptized. I've been forgiven my sins. I'm walking with God. He says, we are made partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said today. When are you supposed to do this? Tomorrow? Day after tomorrow? No. Today. If you will hear His voice, don't harden your hearts. Now, this repetition here, I think, is really important for us. Because I honestly think that one of the greatest dangers any of us face who are Christians in the modern world is the slow, progressive hardening of the hearts which takes place insidiously, painlessly, out of sight, invisibly, just like hardening of the arteries does. You never know it's happening until it's too late. Don't harden your hearts, as in the provocation, whereas for some, when they had heard, did provoke. Not everyone that came out of Egypt by Moses, but with whom was he grieved for 40 years? Wasn't it with those that sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom swore he that they should not enter his rest, but to them that believed not? So we see they could not enter. Why? Because of unbelief. Now you could ask a very justified question at this point. How on earth could someone not believe who had walked dry shod across the bottom of the Red Sea and seen a wall of water on both sides? How on earth could someone who followed that pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire by night, how on earth could anybody who had seen all the miracles of God that delivered them out of Egypt, they were slaves, now they're free, how could someone like that fall into unbelief. When we fall into unbelief, exactly the same way you do. Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left of us entering into his rest, any of you should come short of it. Now the next question is, when is it that you're supposed to take action to prevent these things from happening? Today. Simple, isn't it? Then Jesus comes along with this little information from Matthew 6:23. Seek you first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Take therefore no thought for the morrow shall take thought for itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Now I want to tell you something that you may not have thought about. This is just as true of theology as it is of food and clothing. You know, don't worry about tomorrow. Don't worry about next month. Don't worry about next year. You know, people read prophecy and they study prophecy as though they seem to think, if I can just sort out prophecy, if I can get a unified theory of prophecy, if I can get all the events laid out and what all the signs and seasons and symbols are, well then when the time comes, I'll be able to flee, or I'll be able to go be safe over here, and I'll be able to take care of myself because I knew ahead of time what was going to take place. I'm sorry. It doesn't work that way. The way it will work when the time comes will be just like it worked for Lot, who had no idea what was coming down. Angels were sent into the city, told him to get out of there. He lingered. He waited. He fooled around until finally they took him by the hand and dragged him out of the city. It isn't a question of what you figure out. It's a question of how you live your life today. Because the chances are you'll live your life tomorrow just like you live it today. And the chances are, I've said this before, that you will still be living your life the day Jesus returns the same way you are living it today. Odds are that the change is ever going to be made. It's going to be made now, today, in the present, not out there somewhere, because you won't be able to make the move because of something you see or think you see. That's clear in the Bible. We had a saying in the Navy. If you sat around, a lot worrying about what the commanding officer is going to do next week, or worrying about your next assignment, or worrying about the duty you're going to have, or what have you, someone was bound to pipe up and say, when you're complaining about this over the coffee pot, don't sweat it, Ace. What they meant by that was, the whole idea was, do you do your duty now, and let the stuff you can't control take care of itself. That's a way of living. It's a good way of living. It's not a bad Christian creed either. Do your duty today, and don't sweat it, Ace. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 12. I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. And I gave my heart to seek and search out my wisdom concerning everything that's done under heaven. This sore travail has God given the sons of man to be exercised therewith. What sore travail? The seeking out and searching by wisdom concerning all things that are done under the heaven. The feeling, and I don't know what it is about us, but we have this thing inside of us that makes us or drives us to feel like we have got to know everything. That we can't have anything that's hidden from us. There can't be something that's over there that we don't know about. If it's over there and we don't know about it, we got to go over there and find out about it. It's in man. He's got to do it somehow, some way. He says, this is what God's given us, and it's part of our exercise. I've seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, the whole thing is vanity and a striving after wind. You get there, you chase it down, you find it, and guess what you're going to have when all is said and done? You're going to have a handful of wind. Now that wind may be knowledge that you didn't have before, but the chances are it's going to be knowledge that's really of no special value to the way you're going to live your life the rest of the day or tomorrow or next week. It's just, now I know something that the rest of you people don't know. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. But folks, that doesn't keep us from trying, does it? Now, I don't know what King Solomon is trying to say to us here. But I think what he's trying to say to us is, you had better give attention to living your life on those fundamental principles I talked about earlier, about the things that we can do that are within our reach, the way we live our lives day in and day out. Because there is too much in the world that is crooked for you to straighten out. And there are some of us, I'm afraid, who feel like we have an obligation to correct every error that exists in the world, every error that exists in our extended environment, every error we see people making out there. Basically what Solomon is saying, you can't solve all the world's problems. He said, that which is wanting cannot be numbered. You can't fill it all up. You can't solve all those problems. He says, I communed with my own heart, and I said, lo, look at me. I've come to great estate. I have gotten more wisdom than everyone who has come before me in Jerusalem. My heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. Now, I'll have to tell you the truth. I value wisdom, and I value knowledge, and I have spent a great deal of my life in pursuing knowledge. Now I come upon a man who spent his entire life in the pursuit of knowledge and had the money to do it, had the power to do it. The only problem he had at all was he didn't have the technology that we have to do for the pursuit of knowledge, and that's about the only difference between them. He said, I got all this, and he said, I gave my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And you know what I decided after it was all said and done? I decided it was vanity and a striving after wind. That when I got it and got hold of it, it really didn't amount to much more than a handful of air. That's how Solomon felt about the wisdom and all that stuff that he put together. You know why he said this? He said, because in much wisdom is much grief. And he that increases knowledge increases sorrow. I don't know. It's kind of hard for human beings to get their mind around. But the truth is, there are some things that really it is just probably better not to know. Well, he did his work, and he studied after all of his stuff and gathered his knowledge. And he said in verse 9 of chapter 2, I was great, and I increased before me of all in Jerusalem, and my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired I didn't keep from them. I didn't withhold my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion and all my honor. And I looked on all the works that my hands had worked, all the labor that I'd labored to do, and look at all of it was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. Now, this is hard. And I remember that one time I set in my mind, I'm going to read through. I was on a train trip, had nothing else to do. I flopped up my Bible to Ecclesiastes, and I read straight through the book, slowly, thinking about what I was reading. And I found myself, as I was going along, becoming increasingly depressed over what I was reading here. But as you read along, and as you become depressed by it, what you are doing is sharing the experience and the futility of a man who is learning something very important and is trying to help you to understand it so you don't have to learn it the hard way. Most of the stuff you spend your life chasing around isn't worth a nickel. Most of it is worthless. Most of it will not give you any joy. It won't make your life any better. Most of the stuff you spend your time on is basically wasted. Solomon will come around and tell us basically to live the life of Adam. Enjoy your work. Enjoy your wife. Enjoy your food. Enjoy your drink. Enjoy God. Because that's all you're going to get. Now we know that there is more out there in eternity. But he's talking about in this life. And the fact of the matter is that the stuff beyond those things that we give ourselves to isn't buying us any eternity either. All it's buying us is grief and pain and frustration and vexation of spirit, and is taking us away from the things that really matter. Our creative work, our wives, our families, our God is taking us away from the heart and the core of walking with God. And funny, you can even do that with theology. As you chase after the will-o'-the-wisp of doctrines and prophecies and future things, and don't pay any attention to a man like Solomon who says, son, God has set eternity in your heart, so there is this longing in you for eternity. But he has done it in such a way that you can never find out the end of it from the beginning. You cannot know where it's going. What you can know is how to live your life now. Because God is going to watch the way you live your life now. And he's going to assume from the way you're living your life now that is the way you're always going to live it. Isn't this the way what Jesus said in his parables? The parable of the pounds, the parable of the talents. If you're faithful in a little, you'll be faithful in much. If you're unfaithful in a little, you'll be unfaithful in much. And what's going on right now is a weighing in the hands of each of us, a sifting, a checking of us out to see how we're going to live our life now, from which God can extrapolate and say, this is how this person is going to perform in the end. This is how this person will perform beyond the end into the next world or whatever world God's going to have with him. You don't think that's what's going on? Solomon thought so. Jesus seems to say so. It keeps running at you from every page of the Bible. And none of it really boils down to being able to sort out prophecy. What it boils down to is living your life today. Living a good life, a righteous life. Loving God, loving your family, doing good work, doing good to your neighbor. All the things and all the teachings that Jesus Christ laid out for us, which have to do with the way your life actually works in this world here and now. Not that there wasn't any interest in the world to come, because there certainly is, and there are promises of it. But most of the teachings of Jesus have to do with the way you live it, not tomorrow, but today. If you go back and read again what he said, you'll see that it's true. He says, I turn myself to behold wisdom and madness, verse 12, and folly. For what can the man do that comes after the king? Boy, anybody who comes after me is only going to do what's already been done. So I saw that wisdom excels folly as far as light excels darkness. I know wisdom really is better than stupidity. The wise man's eyes are in his head. The fool walks in darkness. But you know what I figured out? One event happens to both of them. They're both going to die. Now that's, that kind of hits you like a dash of cold water. Yeah, wisdom's good. Wisdom's better than folly. Wisdom's a whole lot better than folly. But the wise man's going to die just like the fool. And you're going to stick their bodies in caskets, and people are going to bring flowers and put them all around it, and both wise man and fool are going to be buried together. And that's that. How have they liked their lives? What has their lives meant? What have they meant? What have they accomplished? Where have they gone? Then I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, so it happens to me. And why did I bother being more wise? And I said in my heart, this also is vanity. There is a vain pursuit of wisdom, a vain pursuit of knowledge, which accomplishes very little except to puff up the person who goes after it. There is no remembrance of the wise more than the fool forever. I think Solomon was being a little pessimistic at this point, but I'll just have to take him at his word. He says, doesn't make any difference. Seeing that now as in the days to come all shall be forgotten. How dies the wise man? He dies just like the fool. He'll wind up in bed someday, in pain from a tumor in his body, or with his life ebbing out of him from some other disease or some illness or just old age. But one or the other way or the other, they're both going to die. Therefore, he says, I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun is grievous to me. Everything is vanity and a striving after wind. I don't know if Solomon actually became suicidal, but he did come to the place where he really hated life. And a lot of people do. A lot of people do. They get tired of the rat race. They go round and round in circles. They become depressed and discouraged with what life has to offer, or rather what it doesn't have to offer. And they give it up. He says, I hated all my work that I had done. This is really when you consider a man who's built beautiful orchards and beautiful vineyards and gorgeous gardens, and he walks out and looks at them and hates them. I kind of halfway understand that. I kind of understand it. Because when it's done, and all you can do is look at it, and suddenly he probably realizes that he got more pleasure in the building of the gardens than he will ever have of them now that they're finished. I was lucky. I learned this lesson when I was a little bitty boy. When week after week, there was a building going up across the way. Seemed like a long time, probably wasn't but a matter of days. There was a building going up across the way, and there was a sand pile, dirt pile more than sand, but sand pile over there. And I would go across the street and take my cars over there, and I would build roads in the sand piles. And I would drive my little cars over these roads and pack them down real good so the cars rolled over them real good. I had toy cars, and I would build roads and build roads. And every time it seemed like that I was getting where I wanted to be, Mother would call me, and I'd have to go into supper. And when I got back over there, somebody had put a forklift into it, or a backhoe into it, and tear it up, or it rained and messed up my roads, and I'd start all over again. So I'd start over again. And I built my roads, and then got called in and got frustrated again. I don't know how many times this happened. Then one day, I basically finished my roads. And I realized that I didn't have anything to do with them now that I built them. I ran my little cars over them a few times, ran them back over it a few times, and then I woke up and realized, as a boy, that I had gotten more joy, more pleasure out of building those roads than I would ever have out of running my toy cars over them. So I kind of understand what Solomon is saying when he says, I looked at my works and I hated them. Because it was at that point he realized that even though he had enjoyed the process of building, the process of development, when it was all through, he didn't really have anything. And you know what's sad about it is, I think about what I know about this man who will say, you know, you can have 1,000 men. I've known 1,000 women, and I haven't found one among them that was really, you know, I don't know what he said. I forget what he said exactly, a good woman or what have you. I think he said maybe one man here and there you can find. I think what the man is talking about is friendship. That he was able to find, maybe build a relationship with a man here or a man there. But out of 1,000 women, he could not build one really good relationship. And I guess it never occurred to them that that's impossible. You can only build a good relationship with one woman. And you can't, that doesn't work if there's another woman anywhere around. It's got to be one man, one woman. And Solomon missed that somewhere. But you see, he gave his life to the things, to the work. He didn't give it to his woman. And therefore, that part of the relationship was shot. And you would have thought that Solomon would have had a really fine relationship with God. After all, the prayer, the reward he'd been given, and all of that. But I'm afraid that all the time that Solomon was building all of his gardens, and all of his plants, and his pools, and all the things that he was giving his time to, somewhere in all of that, the relationship with God went down the tank. That's not hard to imagine either, is it? When you're busy, and your life has more stuff going on in it than you know what to do with, that you can't find time for God in your busy schedule. I can imagine what it's like. In my case, it's hard for me to get away from God in my work that I do. But again, even there is a danger that in the pursuit of this or that aspect of the work, that the relationship with God could also be neglected by someone who lives in it like I do. Every one of us has got to pay attention to our relationships. We've got to pay attention to our relationship with our wife, our husband. We've got to pay attention to our relationship with our children, our parents. We've got to pay attention to our relationship with our friends. And if we haven't figured out by now that we have to pay attention to our relationship with God, there's something missing between our ears. Now, this is what Solomon, I think, is driving at concerning his life. That the things that are important are simple, and there are not very many of them. You have to earn your living. You know, you have to grow your food. If you're a farmer, you have to do these things. You have to make your living. And God hope to God that you can enjoy what it is you do to earn your living. You have to do that. And you have to take care of your family. And you have to build a relationship with your family. But above all, you have got to protect, build, preserve a relationship with God, or none of it is going to matter a hill of beans. Remember what Paul said in the 1 Corinthians 13? You know, remember what he said about, though I understood all mysteries, though I could tell you what was going to happen years out into the future. I had all mysteries. I understood all the scriptures, had all wisdom and all knowledge and all this stuff put together. If I don't have love, it's not worth anything. It's worthless. So if we get our perspective right, even our Bible study, even our choice of the things that we're pursuing in our Bible study ought to give us pause. Are we looking in the Bible for personal correction? Are we looking in the Bible for how to live a life? Are we trying to find out, Lord, how can I do this better? Lord, where did I make my mistakes today? Lord, what have I done that was good that I can do more of? Are we looking at this thing from a way to live the life? Or are we pursuing wisdom and knowledge and all these things which, according to Solomon, you get all that together and neglect your relationships and it's all going to be gone in the process. Well, he said a lot of things in here that I think are really worth taking some time to consider. After he makes his long statement about there's a time to every season, a time for every purpose under heaven in chapter 3, he comes to that little section that I read to you earlier. And I want to come back to this because I think it's critical. He says in verse 10 of chapter 3, I have seen the travail, the work which God gives to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He has made everything beautiful in his time. And to me, one of the great gifts of God and one of the great proofs of God, and one of the things that God speaks to me from the world, is in beauty. Also, he has set eternity in their heart so that no man can find out the work that God makes from the beginning to the end. I know that there is no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and do good in his life. Now, how hard is this, folks? To rejoice and do good in our life. And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of his labor. It's the gift of God. This is fine. This is good. This is right. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, and you can't take anything away from it. And God does it so that men would fear before him. That's, worth keeping in mind. The fear that he's talking about is not so much terror or your knees knocking. It's awe. It is to be awestruck by what God has done, by who he is, and by what he has done. That which has been is now. That which is to be has already been. And this is interesting because you'll want to argue with this. You say, no, there were no airplanes back then. He's not talking about technology. He's talking about fundamental human, moral, and ethical issues. Whatever has been is now, and there's nothing coming that hasn't already been. And God requires of that which is past. In other words, to require it means he's going to require justice for it. Moreover, I saw under the sun the place of judgment, that wickedness was there. I saw the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there. This is really kind of strange for him to say that. You know what I think he's saying? He said, I went to the courts. I went to the place of judgment, and iniquity was there. Lawlessness and sin was there. Then I went to the churches, or the synagogues, and iniquity was there. And I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose and for every work. I said in my heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, that they can see that they're animals. For what befalls the sons of men befalls the animals. As one thing befalls them. As one dies, so dies the other, and they have one breath. A man has no preeminence of a beast in this regard. They're both involved in vanity, and they're both going to die. All go to one place. All are of the dust. All turn to the dust again. Who knows that the spirit of man goes upward, or the spirit of beast goes down to the earth? This, he says, we don't have any hard evidence of that. In his time in life, he really did not. And what he's talking about is man apart from God. This is what's going to happen. Your dog dies, you die, you both go to the ground, and you both rot away back into the elements again. So, I perceive there's nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own work, for that's his portion. Who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? Now, he talks about a lot of things in his book of Ecclesiastes, but I want you to come with me down to chapter 11. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you shall find it after many days. Strange statement. I think it's an idiom or a figure of speech that probably was well known among people at the time, and it has passed into our language basically meaning the same thing. He's basically talking, when he says cast your bread upon the waters, that you have to actually give to chance a lot of the things that you're doing in your life. There are a lot of things you just have to put it in the water and let it go in the trust that somehow or other you're going to find it again downstream. And life is a lot like that. You can't control everything. You can't control every eddy current of life. You can't control all the things that are going to come down upon you. There are times when you've got to cast off and just take it as it comes, day in and day out. I think it's also a matter of as he says in verse 2 of this, give a portion to 7 and also to 8, because you don't know what evil is going to come upon the earth. And what I read between the lines of this is a simple thing. When casting your bread upon the waters and giving a portion to 7 and 8, he is talking about charity, plain old Christian charity, giving to help other people. You cast your bread upon the waters. He says, you'll find, like Jesus said, when he said, make yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness. And it basically means use your money to make yourself some friends out there, because one of these days you're going to need them. And if you sit there and grasp and hold on to everything you've got, you're not going to have friends when you need them. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth, and the trees fall toward the north or toward the south or north, or the place where the tree falls, that's where it's is. That's where it is. What is that all about? Well, I guess in a way, it's sort of like the bumper stickers you see on cars from time to time that say stuff happens. Life is going to happen to you. Rain's going to come down, the tree's going to fall, and when it falls, that's where it's at. Deal with it. Live with it. That life is going to happen with you, and there's not going to be anything you can do to keep it from happening. There's so many metaphors that you can come around with. You got to play it as it lies. You know, if you hit your golf ball down the fairway and it lies in an uncomfortable place or behind a tree, what are you going to do? You're playing an honest game of golf, you play it as it lies. You're playing bridge, you're dealt a bad hand. What are you supposed to do? You play the hand you're dealt. You can moan, you can groan, you can throw your cards against the wall, you can do all kinds of stuff, but in the end, you got to play the hand you're dealt. He says, rain's going to fall and the tree's going to come down, and where it falls, that's where it's going to be. Deal with it. And that's basically what life is all about and what Solomon is trying to tell us. He says, life is going to come to you one day at a time. You can't head it off. You can't know which direction that tree's going to fall. When it comes down, you can deal with it then. Don't worry about it until it does. He that observes the wind shall not sow, and he that regards the clouds is not going to reap. Good old farmer stuff. You just keep watching and you keep waiting. Well, the weather's not quite right today. The wind's out of the wrong direction. Or it's getting a little bit cloudy. And you'll never get your crop in the ground. You'll never get it out of the ground when the time comes if you just keep on doing that. The fact is, what you can do, do it. Do it right now. Do it today. You don't know what is the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones grow in the womb of her that was child, so you know not the works of God, who makes all. In the morning, sow your seed. In the evening, don't withhold your hand. You don't know which one's going to prosper, whether this one or that one, or whether they'll both be good. In other words, get out there and do something. Sow your seed. Get it in the ground. And let's hope for the best. Truly, the light is sweet, and a pleasant thing it is for your eyes to behold the sun. But if a man live many years and rejoice in them all, let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. And everything that comes is vanity. Rejoice, young man, in your youth. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes, but know this, that God, for all these things, will bring you into judgment. Got to answer for every bit of it. Therefore, remove sorrow from your heart, put away evil from your flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity, just like everything else. Then comes this marvelous 12th chapter of Ecclesiastes. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, when the evil days have not come, nor the years draw near when you say, I shall have no pleasure in them. You know, when I read this, I hearken back to a man named Barzillai the Gileadite. He's one of the interesting characters in the Old Testament. Chances are you don't know who he was. He was a best friend of King David. He didn't live in Jerusalem, so David hadn't spent a lot of time with him there. But when he would fled from his son Absalom, he stayed with Barzillai where he was. He was a constant companion. But Barzillai was a very old man. And when David was returning to Jerusalem after the death of Absalom, they came to cross the stream coming back into Jerusalem. And David says, come on in with me. You know, sit at my table, eat my food here. You know, you're my friend. You know, whatever you tell me, whatever you ask of me, I'll give it to you. And it's a marvelous example of friendship. You know, and I've often thought of this. How many people do you know that you can say that to? Whatever you require, it's yours. And they were that kind of friends. But Barzillai's reply always, the courtliness of their discussion is so fascinating, and to see the kind of a relationship that existed between these two fine men. And to see this old man say, you know, he said, my eyes are dim now, I can't really see the dancing girls anymore. And I can't hear very well, so the music really grates on me more than anything else, and I can hardly taste my food. So my coming to your court and sitting at your table would be no pleasure to me at all. It would be a burden. You let me go. I want to go home. And he did. And you come to this and you read this where he says, the days are going to come near when you have no pleasure in them. It is something for every young man to think about. And you need to be living your life today, not somewhere off in the distant future. I don't mean that you're wasteful or anything of the sort. I just mean that every day has got to be lived. Every opportunity has got to be taken. Everything must be challenged and dealt with now, not tomorrow, not some other time. He said, the days will come when you have no pleasure in them, when the sun or the light of the moon or the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain. In the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look out the window are darkened. It's a strange analogy he's drawing here. He's almost talking about the human body like an old, old man. How that everything is slowing down. The grinders, whatever they are internally, are stopping. You found about the human man almost like a village. And those that look out of the windows are darkened, which you look out of your eyes and you can't see things very well. and the doors are shut in the streets when the sound of grinding is low, and somebody jumps up at the voice of a bird because it's so rare to hear one, and the daughters of music are brought low. Also, when they shall be afraid of that which is near, and fear shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshopper becomes a burden, and the desire shall fail, because man goes to his long home. Where's that? It's across over there in the cemetery. Be there for a long time. Man goes to his long home, and the mourners are walking up and down the streets. Before the silver cord is loosed, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is broken at the fountain, or the wheel at the cistern, all of which are symbols of the death of a man or a woman. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return to the God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. And moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed, and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and that which was written was upright. It was words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads. And you know, this is something which we need to give a little more attention to, frankly. I'll even say I need to give a little more attention to it. But I had an interesting illustration recently. You know what a goad is? A goad's like a nail on the end of a stick that you use to punch an ox, to get him to move. He says the words of the wise are like that. I had occasion recently to correct a young man. And it was interesting to me when I pointed out the mistake I thought he was making. He just rolled over it. Just justified himself and rolled over it as though I hadn't got a clue what I was talking about. And he's going to pay a terrible penalty for that. And the penalty is he will never get a word of advice from me again. And to him, my advice would be of enormous value if he only knew it. But he wouldn't listen. I think sometimes those of us who are older need to occasionally use the goad on young people. I mean, we don't have to humiliate them. We don't have to pour cold water on them. But I really think probably we should be more quick to point out errors, to point out mistakes in a loving fashion, in a caring fashion. Say, look, I like you, but if you keep doing this, you're going to wreck your life. Are good words. They're like nails fastened by the masters of assembly that are given from one shepherd. And further, by these, my son, be admonished. Of the making of books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh, and not a whole lot more. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Earlier he will say, live joyfully, all with the wife of your youth, all the days that God has given you, because that's your portion. Be like Adam. Enjoy your work. Enjoy your wife. Enjoy your family. Enjoy living. Enjoy your relationship with God. And do it today. Because worrying about the end of all these things is trying or worrying about something that you'll never be able to sort out because God set it in your heart so you couldn't. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it will be evil. So maybe, like Adam, we can open our eyes on the first day of the rest of our lives and begin to focus on those things that are simple, those things that are today, those things that make a difference in our lives, and put some of the rest of the stuff on back burners.